Welcome to the PetroPapers podcast. Say that 10 times fast. This is where you get your oil and gas intellectual stimulation by asking the technical questions. I'm Yoga Shripadan, and today is going to be a monologue because we're going to talk about Steve Jones's technical legacy. This entire season of PetroPapers was a little bit different because instead of investigating papers, we were investigating people. And while Steve Jones is no longer with us, his technical legacy still lives on. And I thought it would be appropriate to end the PetroPapers podcast season 4, particularly, by talking about him today and his papers. Let's get into it. So a little bit about Steve Jones. He most recently worked for Cimarex Energy before he started his own consulting service. But as far as education goes, he got his master's in petroleum engineering from the University of Texas, hook 'em. And then in 1981 got his BS in petroleum engineering at Tulsa. From 1983 to 2001, he served in various roles as a petroleum and reservoir engineer, particularly Grace Petroleum, Genesis, and Joshi Technologies. In 2001 to 2016, he was a reservoir engineer and advisor for Newfield Exploration. And then from 2016 to 2021, he was a reservoir engineer advisor for Cimarex before he retired. This is one of the reasons that there were many reasons as to why Steve Jones impacted me. And that's how I got to know of him when he started working when he was in Newfield and then when he was at Cimarex. But I'll get more into that later on. As far as technical papers go, there are 5 technical papers I found on OnePetro. For those of you who are listening to this monologue, if you know of any other papers that I haven't mentioned, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll include them in the description box on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. The first paper is Flowback fracture closure, a key factor for estimating effective pore volume. The next paper is estimating reservoir pressure from early flowback data. The next paper is producing gas-oil ratio behavior of tight oil reservoirs. And then estimating effective fracture pore volume from early single-phase flowback data and relating it to fracture design parameters. And then the last paper is estimating fracture pore volume from flowback data and evaluating its relationship to design parameters of multi-stage fracture completion. The first paper I'll talk about is estimating reservoir pressure from early flowback data. This is one of my favorite papers from Steve Jones because it helps us figure out what is the initial reservoir pressure and you don't need to have flowing bottom hole pressure for it. Although what I will say is you don't need to do a defit. What I will say is there's nothing that replaces your true measurements of reservoir pressure, but this is one way to get it. So this is based on estimating flowing bottom hole pressure near the time of first hydrocarbon production where the well is flowing back frac load. The method is important because of the difficulty in measuring initial reservoir pressure in extremely low permeability in conventional reservoirs. It requires no special instrumentation, no modification of flowback procedures, as long as the flowing bottom hole pressure reduction is gradual. Pressures and rates are measured hourly at the surface, along with fluid properties and wellbore configuration, and they're all that's needed. That's why I really like this paper. It's pretty simple to figure out how you can get initial reservoir pressure. The next paper I'll talk about is flowback fracture closure, a key factor for estimating effective pore volume. This paper proposes a 2-tank model for reducing parameter uncertainty and fracture PV independent of fracture geometry. The study starts by the use of rate-normalized pressure plots to observe changes in fluid flow mechanisms from multi-stage fractured wells. The fracture pressure supercharge observations from the basis of developing the proposed 2-phase tank model. This model is a linear relationship between rate-normalized pressure and time, useful for interpreting flowback data in wells that show pseudo-steady state behavior, unit slope on the log-log rate normalized pressure plots. The linear relationship is implemented on a simple Monte Carlo spreadsheet. This is then used to estimate and conduct uncertainty analysis on effective fracture pore volume contributions and various drive mechanisms during flowback, fracture closure, gas expansion, and water depletion by use of quantitative drive indices similar to those used in conventional reservoir engineering. The application of the proposed tank model to flowback data from 15 shale gas and tight oil wells estimates that the effective fracture pore volume and initial average gas saturation in the active fracture network. The results show that the fracture PV estimation is most sensitive to fracture closure compared with the gas expansion and water depletion, making fracture closure the primary drive mechanism during early flowback periods. Also, the initial average gas saturation for all wells is less than 20%. The parameters estimated from the proposed model could be used as input guides for more complex studies such as discrete fracture network modeling and transient flowback simulation. This reduces the number of unknown parameters and uncertainty in output results from complex models. Next paper I'll talk about is producing gas-oil ratio behavior of tight oil reservoirs, and this is another favorite paper of mine, which prompted me to write a paper of my own on observing gas-oil trends in the Permian Basin. So this paper explains the reasons for observed behavior using reservoir simulation with field examples from stack and scoop plays of the Anadarko Basin in central Oklahoma. A framework for interpreting observed GOR behavior in tight black oil reservoirs is based on the following stages in the well's history. Some stages may not be visible due to the degree of undersaturation, flowing bottom hole pressure schedule, finite conductivity fractures, and duration of the transient flow period. So there's early GOR constant at the initial solution gas-oil ratio while the flowing bottom hole pressure is above bubble point. There's a rise in GOR and the bottom hole flowing pressure declines below bubble point. The transient GOR plateau, which is characteristic of transient linear flow. A continuous rise in GOR during the boundary dominated flow. So those are the four things to look at. The fundamental differences between linear and radial flow, which cause the dependence of GOR on flowing bottom hole pressure, are explained using simulation. During transient linear flow, the GOR response to changes in flowing bottom hole pressure is independent of permeability and infinite conductivity fractures, but not for finite conductivity fractures. Several practical observations are made, knowing that solution gas-oil ratio, initial solution gas-oil ratio, and the transient GOR plateau level in an area that can help you interpret where a well is in GOR history. Rate transient analysis diagnostic plots are altered by rising GOR and sometimes show an early unit slope. During boundary-dominated flow, GOR is more of a function of cumulative production than of time. Wells with closer fracture spacing have a faster GOR rise with time, but also recover more oil quickly. If compound linear flow develops, GOR can decline late in a well life. The Merrimack and Woodford formations in the stack can be history matched without involving a suppressed bubble point due to poor proximity effects. The critical gas saturation in the Merrimack appears to be the range of 0 to 5%. The technical contributions include a framework for interpreting GOR behavior over the life of the well, changing the effect of changing bottom hole pressure on changing bottom hole flowing pressure on GOR, on fracture spacing, conductivity, half length on GOR, and the effect of GOR on RTA diagnostic plots. So this prompted me to write my own paper on observed GOR trends in the Permian Basin, or in unconventional plays, which I published in 2020. Fun enough, he did send me a LinkedIn message, Steve Jones, that he really enjoyed my paper, which made my year. And the last paper I'm going to talk about is estimating effective fracture pore volume from flowback data and evaluating its relationship to design parameters of multi-stage fracture completion. Flowback data from 7 multi-fractured horizontal tight oil gas wells in the Anadarko Basin show 2 separate regions during the single-phase water production. Region 1 shows a drop in casing pressure, and Region 2 shows a flattening casing pressure. This paper investigates the flowback behavior of 2 regions and illustrates on how flowback data can be interpreted to estimate effective fracture pore volume and to investigate its relationship to completion design parameters. They construct diagnostic plots to understand the physics of Regions 1 and Region 2. Region 1 represents a pressure depletion in fractures, and Region 2 represents the hydrocarbon breakthrough through effective fracture network. The results of the analysis indicate that the duration of Region 1 depends on initial reservoir pressure and hydrocarbon type. They apply a previous flowback model on Region 1 to estimate effective fracture pore volume, and also propose a procedure to estimate fracture compressibility by the use of DFITs. The results suggest that the estimated effective fracture pore volume is very sensitive to fracture compressibility and is generally larger than the final load recovery volume and less than the total injected water volume. The results also suggest that most of the effective fractures unpropped and host the non-recovered fracturing water. They investigate the relationship between the estimated effective fracture pore volumes and completion design parameters, including total injected water volume, proppant mass, gross perforated interval, number of clusters, by the use of the Pearson correlation coefficient method. The results show that the total injected water volume, gross perforated interval, and the number of clusters are among the key design parameters for optimal fracturing treatment. And then the higher total injected water volume and closer cluster spacing generally lead to larger effective fracture pore volume. So this paper has been like the genesis of trying to have bigger fracs and pumping more sand and more fluid. I don't know if it's a genesis, but I would like to think so, into saying that you can get an effective frac by tightening your cluster spacing. So those are all the papers that I wanted to talk about, and this is the technical legacy of Steve Jones, however brief it may be, because I do understand the attention spans of the listeners. I will put the paper numbers in the description box for Apple Podcasts and the YouTube, but I wanted to honor Steve Jones' technical legacy by having this episode and thinking that perhaps these papers will perhaps this can increase the awareness of Steve Jones's papers, and his legacy can move on and on. I hope that this does justice, and he has definitely made an impact in my career, even though we've never met in person, because he was the reason why I chose to work for the company that I'm working for today. Well, folks, this is everything that I wanted to share. This is PetroPapers, Season 4, or end of Season 4. I'm Yoga Shupradhan, and I'm signing off.